Good afternoon. My name is David Bobb. I serve as director of the Allan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship of Hillsdale College. Welcome to today's lecture. Our topic is Washington, D.C. Monuments and Memorials, Old and New. We're pleased today to be joined by Michael J. Lewis, who is a professor of art at Williams College. And today we owe him special thanks for this lecture, as throughout this week he's been battling laryngitis and had canceled his classes, but the show must go on, and so today he's here to offer this lecture and looks forward to all of your questions. This lecture series is sponsored by Chris and Sarah Chicola. We're grateful for their support in making it possible. It's a monthly lecture series, and at the end of today's event, I'll note our upcoming talk for the month of April. Today, I'm going to start just by noting a couple of things for those of you who are joining us on the online audience, and that is that you may also participate in the Q&A session and may submit questions to us via email at firstfridays@hillsdale.edu. We'll also invite you to click on the PowerPoint presentation, which will accompany today's lecture. It is right there by your viewer, and you can see that online. For those of you who are with us today, you can find that then in the archived version as well. To introduce our speaker this morning, I would like to ask Hillsdale College junior Daniel Anderson to come forward. Dan, this semester, is interning at Freedom Works, and he's a major in political economy. Daniel.
Good afternoon. Michael J. Lewis is the Faison Pierson Stoddard Professor of Art at Williams College. An architectural critic, he is the author of The Gothic Revival, American Art and Architecture, and the prize-winning August Reichensperger, The Politics of the German Gothic Revival. A recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, he has taught at Bryn Mawr College, McGill University, and the University of Natal, South Africa. He received his BA from Harvard College and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Today, he will be speaking on the topic, Washington, D.C., Monuments and Memorials, Old and New. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Lewis.
Thank you. I really don't have much of a voice, so forgive me. This has been a remarkable year for the making of monuments in this city and elsewhere. The memorial at Ground Zero opened last September in New York, Michael Arad's mournful subterranean shrine that occupies the exact footprint of the missing towers. 1 month later came the dedication of the Martin Luther King Memorial here in Washington, shown at the bottom. And soon to come to Washington, or perhaps not, is the memorial to President Eisenhower, which is to be a collaboration between architect Frank Gehry and the sculptor Charles Ray. I show their model here. Each of these monuments has been the subject of furious controversy, especially in Washington. The Martin Luther King Memorial was criticized for engaging a sculptor from communist China who promptly saw to it that Chinese granite was used for the structure in place of American granite, which is abundant, all of which accounts for the Made in China inscription here in this cartoon. Even worse, the memorial managed to misquote the great man in 2 ways. Not only did he never say, "I was a drum major for peace, justice, peace, and righteousness," but his actual words were a hypothetical statement put in someone else's mouth. This is not the worst of failings. Inscriptions can be recarved, as we have learned. But what has anchored critics, and not merely conservative critics, but leaders in the civil rights movement, is the demeanor and the expression of the sculpture. Because King was above all an orator, and in the images we have of him, he is invariably open in stance, speaking, gesturing, gesticulating, otherwise engaging with the public. The energy of his life force was directed outward. And yet in the King Memorial, he is depicted with his arms folded, utterly detached, as if hermetically sealed and self-contained. Instead of the inspiring warmth of the man, there was only the infinite aloofness of an idol. Now, as it happens, the proposed Eisenhower monument has been criticized on the opposite grounds. Instead of making its subject a 30-foot effigy, it turns him instead into a barefoot, diminutive country boy. The proposal calls for an outdoor public place that is not quite a formal civic plaza, not quite an urban park. Columns in the background will support a wire mesh that will depict images of the Kansas prairie, the site of Eisenhower's childhood. And at the center will be the sculpture of the man himself, not monumental, but life-size, presumably along the lines of the similar statue at his birthplace in Abilene. Here, too, there has been great disbelief and dismay. After all, there were millions of barefoot country boys, but only one commander-in-chief of the Allies in World War II who led the great fight of freedom against tyranny. Now, the odd configuration of the Eisenhower Memorial, which offers no culminating focal point, but instead presents multiple images and attractions, is not surprising when one looks at the work of its author, Frank Gehry, whose Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao is one of the most sensational buildings of the last generation. But Gehry's fluttering and writhing forms, at which he excels, are the stuff of spectacle and are hardly the training ground to prepare one to make a statement of tragic dignity, which is the theme of every monument. And so, like the King Memorial, it has come in for ridicule, as depicted here on the back of an $11 bill proclaiming, "In Gehry we trust." Now, as different as these memorials are, the public's disappointment in each case has had the same cause. These aren't the men we knew. This is not Eisenhower, the victorious general, president of integrity and vision. This is not Martin Luther King, the impassioned orator. I share the dismay, but let's face it, it is not easy to make a succinct statement in sculptural form of the essence of a man's life. But this is something that American art has always struggled with in our chronic divided loyalty between realism and idealism. As a population, we tend to be literal-minded and idealistic, and invariably we struggle to mix the two, as the sculptor Horatio Greeno did when he placed a realistic bust of George Washington on the body of the Olympian Zeus in 1840, to the great consternation of the public. There's something wrong here, but contemporaries were not sure exactly what it was. Whatever it was not what one perturbed viewer thought, which is that the father of our country would never be so imprudent as to expose his body to the air after a bath. But I propose that this is the least of the problems with the Eisenhower and King memorials, the problem that they fail to hit exactly the right note. I want to suggest today that the problem goes deeper, and that they fail fundamentally and unnecessarily as monuments, not because they misunderstand the nature of their subject, but because they misunderstand the nature of a monument. They do not even know what a monument is or should be. And if this is the case, then we have a bigger problem than a pair of ill-advised and clumsy works of contemporary public art. How do you define a monument? For purposes of our talk today, let us say that a monument is the expression of a single powerful idea in a single emphatic form, colossal in scale, permanent in materials, and projected into public space. Something very small, smaller than our own body, for example, cannot be a monument, although it might be a memorial, such as a bronze plaque on the wall. Too much is made of the distinction between monuments and memorials, I suspect. But I think if asked, Frank Gehry would say something quite different. He would argue that a monument is not a thing, but a process, an open-ended conversation in which various constituencies bring different interpretations to different forms. I have heard versions of this definition throughout my career, but for reasons I want to make clear today, this is simply not good enough. Let me explain. We have all seen those spontaneous roadside memorials, those improvised votive offerings that mark the site of a traffic fatality. They are a relatively new phenomenon, only a generation or so old. One did not see them before the 1980s. As physical objects, they're mere ephemera, but as a mass cultural phenomenon, they are quite important, and they testify to a deep and unfulfilled human need for memorials, a need that, for whatever the reason, is not being met today. Once you begin to look for these, you find them everywhere, all over the roads of Virginia. I think particularly in Virginia. Here is a completely new form of folk art, and you'll note that it is immediately extremely conventionalized in its expression. Notice, for one thing, how extremely narrow is the repertoire of forms and materials. Crosses, flowers, hand-painted signs, and, heartbreakingly, in the case of a child, stuffed animals. But there is very little else, little striving for originality. They seek to find generally understood symbols which they use to achieve resolution and closure. They certainly do not speak of an open-ended process. And in a way, these roadside anonymous sculptors understand what many contemporary artists do not, and that is that monumentality, because it is a public form of art, must be legible, and this requires convention. As with human speech, we invent new sentences, but we use old words. And it is for this reason that most traditional monuments are variants of a few ancient types: the triumphal arch, the colossal column, the obelisk, and the temple. If you go to Rome and see the Pantheon, you'll see one in front of the other. Now, since the 1930s, it has been fashionable to disparage all of this as so much architectural grave robbing, deferring to classical antiquity rather than creating our own forms. But we should not think of these forms so much as ancient as timeless. After all, the arch is nothing more than a space of passage made monumental. An obelisk or a column is nothing more than an exclamation point raised above a sacred spot. A temple is simply a tabernacle, the sacred tent raised above an altar. These ideas are unchanging, and it is not surprising that the one truly successful work of contemporary public art, the Vietnam Memorial, took for its form one of the most ancient of all, the mural shrine, the Wailing Wall. And because of their ability to transcend time by connecting themselves to primal human qualities, activities, passage, gathering, shelter, that the best monuments somehow never seem dated. An object like the Jefferson Memorial, John Russell Pope's masterpiece, does not make us think of 1940, but of Thomas Jefferson, and it with the most effective means possible, shape alone, to commemorate the finest intellect ever to be president, author of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. Pope chose the most perfect of all forms, the sphere, a physical manifestation of the clarity of his mind. How different the Lincoln Memorial, that four-square citadel. Here the theme is heroic fortitude, a cincture of closely spaced columns huddled together about the windowless central shrine, expressing not clarity, but endurance. And different yet again, the Washington Monument, which fittingly is a vehement founding gesture, a single bold mark against the sky. And for this, the motto was that greatest of architectural point markers, the obelisk of the Egyptians, that pointer of the sundial that connected the earth to the sun to tell us when time itself began. Each of these structures makes a single great claim, and it is this singleness of expression that makes them monumental. A monument can only say one thing: we honor, we celebrate, we endured, we won, or even we grieve. We grieve. This is the message of Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which demonstrated that it is not necessary to be neoclassical to be monumental. The vast sweep of space, the simplicity of materials, just earth and stone, and the massive authority of a single lucid shape, all these are monumental in the best sense. Perhaps the most poetic gesture of all is the way she solved the problem of listing the names of all the some 58,000 dead. It was determined that they should appear in order of the date of death rather than alphabetically, which gave the whole structure the character of a long, sad calendar of death. But she did not simply start at one end in 1959 and continue on through to 1975, the last names fading away in the earth. Instead, she began and ended the timeline in the center, at the vertex, so that the name of the last to die would touch the name of the first to die. Here she gave the monument a point of repose, a moment of resolution, the point where things begin and end, which transforms a linear timeline into something cyclical and regenerative, and makes its central moment a kind of altar. Not very long ago, it was fashionable to sneer at these things. Frank Lloyd Wright found the Jefferson Memorial preposterous, the equivalent of flying a modern airplane while wearing a toga. As it happens, though, he wrote his attack against the memorial some 70 years ago, and there are a good many things from 1940 which now look much more dated than the Jefferson Memorial. But true monumentality, as Maya Lin revealed, has little to do with style and everything to do with simplicity. The great sculptor Rodin said, when asked to define sculpture, supposedly this may be apocryphal, he said that sculpture is what happens when you roll a statue down the flight of steps. Well, what happens is everything incidental breaks off. The gesticulating hands, the props, the swords, the head perhaps, leaving only a powerful torso, free of incident or digression. There is a splendid word for this laconic style of expression, lapidary, which comes from the Latin word lapis, stone. Lapidary was the Roman term for the verbal compression necessary when one is carving an inscription in stone. I suppose the modern version would be telegram style, when you used to have to pay for every word, but somehow now telegrams seem even more ancient than inscriptions. And so, like the inscriptions they bear, the best monuments are lapidary. They have that splendid economy of expression that comes from saying one thing and saying it monumentally. But the minute a monument tries to say more than one thing, and to say many things, it is no longer a monument, but a Russian novel. As we see in that most garrulous of Washington memorials, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, which is monumental, alas, only in its verbosity. The memorial was designed by Lawrence Halperin with sculpture by George Siegel, and provides a sequence of 4 outdoor rooms corresponding to Roosevelt's 4 terms. Each presents a visual tableau, lavishly outfitted with bronze statues, relief sculpture, and inscriptions. For example, the first term is dramatized with a vignette of a Depression-era bread line, showing us the despair and misery at the moment Roosevelt took office. It is an unsettling image, probably because it is an attempt to render in sculpture the kind of imagery we know from photographs of the era, such as Dorothea Lange's bread line. In the next room, we have a vignette of an American listening intently to one of Roosevelt's fireside chats, another image of hard times. Notice the bare feet. But also the gesture of leaning into the radio, a poignant image of listening with hope. Through all of this runs an insistent literalism. Nothing is rendered abstractly or symbolically. It's a kind of cross-pollination of a diorama in a museum with Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. We even have FDR's dog Fala, pantingly immortalized in bronze. But despite all these discursive tableaus, this visual wordiness, the memorial is sometimes quite at a loss for words. During the design process, anti-smoking groups succeeded in eliminating Roosevelt's ubiquitous cigarette holder. Evidently, Halperin and his collaborators did not recognize that Roosevelt's cigarette holder was not the sign of a lamentable addiction. It was the president's most effective visual prop. He clenched it in his teeth with his jaw thrust forward so that it pointed upwards jauntily to create an image of buoyant, unshakable optimism. But even as the cigarette was excised, pressure from activist groups for the disabled ensured that Roosevelt would be depicted as wheelchair-bound and handicapped with polio, a fact he carefully suppressed in his public appearances. And so the element he flaunted was eliminated, the element he concealed was stressed, and so Roosevelt, that rakish and jaunty cavalier, was transformed into a differently abled and rather prim non-smoker. I can't help think that Roosevelt was a much more gifted creator of inspiring visual imagery than the makers of his own monument. By the way, you will notice behind Roosevelt is a quotation that is a generic attack on totalitarianism, which is utterly unremarkable. What is remarkable is what it should say, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. So for a memorial that is otherwise so garrulous, here again, it is at a loss for words. By the way, this is by no means the most outrageous reinvention of Roosevelt. At this very moment, on Roosevelt Island in New York, the Roosevelt Island Memorial by Louis Kahn is now being built. At the southern tip of the island will eventually be a colossal bust of the president, which may well prove successful. To judge from the model, it's too early to tell. But nearby is to be a second inspirational sculpture dedicated to Roosevelt's handicap. The intentions, to be sure, are good, and the sculpture is to be based on a photograph that is actually quite touching of Roosevelt in his wheelchair with a young girl in her polio braces petting Fala. But great intentions are no guarantee of great art, and it is almost never a good idea to base a three-dimensional work of art on a two-dimensional image. One hesitates at this point to criticize the sculpture since we only have the model, but my sense is that it will be very pious, very earnest, very heartwarming, but by no means a great work of art. And yet it tells much about the state of monuments today in its discursiveness, sentimentality, its addiction to narrative literalism in place of allegory, and asking to be judged on its intentions rather than its visual coherence. How do we get to this point? Ironically, it began with a reaction against overwrought memorials of the Victorian era, things such as the Albert Memorial in London with its comprehensive allegory of English cultural, scientific, and political life, which seems to want to tell you about everything, even the 4 continents with their distinctive inhabitants, animal, human, and otherwise, are all present. So it manages in good Victorian fashion to be a monument and an encyclopedia. So here's a kind of visual excess not too far removed from the FDR Memorial. But perhaps the most bombastic of all was the Victor Emmanuel monument in Rome, piece of colossal opera scenery, serving merely as backdrop to an equestrian statue. It was this overblown rhetoric that convinced modern architects that we needed a new language of monumentality. And so while modernism went about dismantling the structures of traditional society, culture, religion, the political social order, even the family, it soon came to about dismantling arches and columns that had paid tribute to that same traditional order. But this is not as easy as it sounds, because modernism is concerned with reform in the future, looking forward, not backward, and because monuments are always retrospective, it was difficult to find a modernist language of monumentality. Still, there were fascinating attempts. Probably the best is Vladimir Tatlin's design for a monument to the Third International. But if modern technology did not seem to lend itself easily to the making of monuments, it got better. In the 1960s, there came a movement of monumental art we now know as Earth art. It culminated in the late 60s with the first Earth Day of 1969, 1 year after the publication of Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, that immensely influential and immensely destructive book. And there's no question that it could achieve genuine monumentality. Look at Robert Smithson's spiral jetty in the Great Salt Lake. Although in the end we should perhaps classify it as a species of anti-monument, for it is deliberately cryptic and obscure in its meaning, as cryptic as a cave painting. And as I propose, monumental expression requires lucidity. Maya Lin's Vietnam monument came less than a decade after Spiral Jetty, and it is in the same tradition of earthworks, shaping the earth through mounds and embankments. But we forget how furious the reception was when it was first shown. So vehement was the opposition to it that it could only be built with the addition of a group of realistic figural sculpture, The Fighting Men by the late Frederick Hart. This depiction of a trio of combat infantrymen returning grim, drenched, weary, back from a patrol. We can imagine them here stepping out of a clearing. And if your taste is for the realistic in sculpture, Hart's are the best. He actually did the bronze doors to the Washington Cathedral. But then something curious happened. Hart carefully made a point of depicting a black, a white, and a Hispanic soldier, but he did not depict a woman. And shortly after, the monument was augmented by yet a third memorial, this time honoring the women who died in Vietnam. The sculptor selected was Glenna Goodacre, who paraphrased Michelangelo's Pietà, and not badly. The wounded soldier reposes like the dead Christ in the nurse's lap, and in place of Michelangelo's billowing skirts for his Madonna, we have here a pyramid of sandbags, a skillful adaptation. It is so skillful, I am chagrined to confess that Glenna Goodacre is also the designer of the Sacagawea dollar coin, that most unloved item of American currency. But there's a problem here. The fact is, 7 women died during the war, who are represented here by 3 statues. What about the other 4? Notice the math. Hart represented 58,000 dead soldiers with 3 statues. Goodacre has 3 who represent 7 women dead. We are rapidly approaching the point where we are no longer dealing with symbolism, but a straight one-to-one representation. And I'm afraid to say that this was the ultimate lesson of the Vietnam Memorial. While America's most flagrantly progressive and avant-garde artists openly mocked Frederick Hart's fighting men for the realism, when it came time for them to propose their own monuments, fashionable designers such as Gehry or Halprin preferred easygoing literalism to the sublime abstraction of Maya Lin. For example, the Korean Memorial, begun in 1988 by the sculptor Frank Gaylord, tried to have the best of both worlds, merging Maya Lin's wall with Hart's fighting men. Here the subject is again a platoon on patrol, in this case 19 bronze soldiers trudging heavily uphill, burdened by heavy ponchos. You have the sense of the harsh Korean winter. Now, it was originally intended to depict not 19, but 38 soldiers, representing the 38th parallel along which the war pivoted. In the end, it was cut in half, presumably for reasons of budget, with the unbelievably lame justification that it would be doubled by the reflecting mirror of the back wall. 19 times 2 equals 38. Get it? We get it. Here is an utter misunderstanding of the means and ends of allegory. Normally, allegory uses interlocking symbols to comment on the things that matter: truth, honor, sacrifice, life. Here it is inverted. Something that really matters, human lives, are being used to represent something that is only an accident of military geography, an imaginary line in the earth. Now, how can it be that this language of allegory, once generally understood by our culture as a whole, has been banished from America's most sacred sites, banished so completely that in order to find a living example of it, I have to find a roadside Virginia shrine for an unambiguous statement of grief and love? I believe it has something to do with this. In the 1960s, there spread the idea that we no longer needed formal conventions, the conventions of etiquette. What we needed was authenticity and sincerity. We didn't need this. We needed to be genuine. Those of us over 50, me and a couple of you, remember how the mantra of that era was to tell it like it is. We were urged to speak from the heart, man, to improvise. And if the improvisation faltered, as it often does, well, in that case, stumbling inarticulateness could be taken as a badge of sincerity. But of course, as Emily Post tells us, there are situations that are too serious to trust to improvisation. There are moments when you need a convention, and you cannot improve upon it by felicitous extemporization. The polite inquiry, how are you? The statement of well wishes, I wish you the best. The statement of condolence, I'm sorry for your loss. These are not trite platitudes, but they are conventions. And social interaction requires social convention. The problem is that those people who refuse to use conventional sayings, such as, I am sorry for your loss, run the danger of saying something original but inappropriate, like, well, at least he's out of his misery, or that's a bummer, or my uncle had a similar tumor. In other words, ghastly things. In other words, if you trust to your originality, all that you can be sure of is that whatever inappropriate notion that is bobbing along at the top of your unconscious will be blurted out. And as it is with social etiquette, so it is with memorials. The Vietnam Memorial succeeds because it says, and in the simplest terms possible, I am sorry for your loss. If one tries to say anything else, if one tries to add to that statement, make it original, one risks vulgarity, indecency, or even worse, as the attacks of 9/11 made clear. On that day, a day that will live in infamy, the most agonizing of all images were those of those trapped workers in those towers who, their backs to the inferno, leapt to their deaths, some 200 in all. We can only look at an image like this with reverence and compassion and with our prayers. And yet, look at it. It is a very human image. It is our pietà. It reminds us of our own mortality. It is part of the great common human experience. It cries out for an artistic response. But an artist who would sweep away the traditional conventions for dealing with the great truths of life and death and sacrifice, if you do that, all you have left is to snuffle about in the cupboard of your own storehouse of mental images. And such is the fate of the first artist who tried to make monumental art out of 9/11, Eric Fischl, who made a colossal bronze that he called Falling Woman. This is what happens when you trust to improvisation. Rather than saying, I am sorry for your loss, it is saying, I cannot get this out of my head. But this is not public art. This is private indulgence. So in the end, the Ground Zero Memorial was not as bad as I feared, but not as good as it should have been. The key decision was, of course, to maintain the footprint of the towers, which unfortunately means that the dominant expression is the collapse of the buildings themselves and not the lives within. If it has something of the laconic restraint of the Vietnam Memorial, this is to be expected because Maya Lin was on the jury and played a prominent role. And in effect, she created an urban version of her landscape memorial, the same sense of void, absence, the same minimalism, the same remote austerity. But in one respect, though, and a critical respect, it fails to achieve the spatial resolution of Vietnam, the bringing together of all its energy at a single point. At Vietnam, the names are in order of the sequence of death and have a kind of sad rhythm. But obviously, this could not be done at Ground Zero, where effectively all died at the same moment. And so, the names there are placed according to random computer-generated sequence. Let me make a modest suggestion. In the future, in a monument, there must be nothing random or computer-generated. So let me conclude, let me return to the monuments in Washington that have been so controversial this season. The Eisenhower Project, we can now see, is scarcely a memorial, let alone a monument. Its principal object, the sculpture of Eisenhower as a farm boy, is dwarfed by the colossal backdrop that surrounds him. It will be these images, abstract depictions of the Kansas countryside, photographic images of Eisenhower's life, that provide the dominant visual note. Equally distressing is the mesh of iron that is intended to depict the Kansan topography, shown here in a test installation. One wag has called this the Eisen curtain. Eisen is the German word for iron. Tear down this wall. Lost and adrift somewhere in this theme park of billboards and fragmented colonnades is diminutive Eisenhower himself, diminutive and diminished, and probably a bit bewildered. What does this have to say about the guiding spirit of D-Day? D-Day was an act of greatness, and this memorial expresses, if anything, a distinct uneasiness with greatness. What about the Martin Luther King Memorial? Here it seems to be too much greatness, and greatness of the wrong sort. The most familiar charge is that it recalls the despotic sculpture of Leninist Maoist regimes with their avuncular but stern dear leaders. And to be fair, the sculptor Li Yi-shin has spent his entire life in such a culture, and it is to be expected that his design would be a kind of surrogate Mao image. And to be sure, there is something imperious and implacable about the face of King, a kind of lithic ruthlessness. It certainly seems far fiercer than that of our other national martyr to human rights, Abraham Lincoln. But I want to propose that the difference here is not so much between American and Chinese values, although they are at play, but between granite and marble. King is carved out of granite, a dense stone with a crystalline structure that is carved with the greatest of effort. It forces a language of sharp lines, flat planes, and a generalized roundness. The marble out of which Lincoln is carved is a more supple material, permitting a soft, descriptive modeling of cheek, foreheads, anatomic specificity. When one looks at King with his lidded eyes, those double lines delineating eyes and lips, one realizes that this is really the most primal sculptural language of all, that of ancient Egypt, as seen here in Pharaoh Ramses II, an icon shaped to match the unyielding crystalline compactness of granite. And so it would be convenient if we could simply dismiss the King Memorial as a sublimated item of totalitarian leader worship. Our quarrel is really with the granite. If one builds statuary for the outdoors, this is the material one must use. But there is a far greater problem with the King Memorial, and this has to do with its overall conception. It was inspired by a line from King's I Have a Dream speech, which promises that together we will build out of a mountain of despair a stone of hope. And in case anyone nodding off has missed the point, here's the mountain of despair, and there is the stone of hope advancing forward like a pawn on a chessboard. In other words, just as the King Memorial relegated its human figures into symbols of the 38th parallel, here King himself is downgraded to an illustration of his own wordplay. A figure of speech is beautiful because it calls to mind a mental picture. But actually, to build a scale model of a metaphor is to do it violence and to render laughable in reality what is beautiful in the imagination. Somehow, King's greatness is diminished by confining it within the precincts of his own wordplay. A monument should be limitless. Let me give an example. In 1880, the great American architect Richardson was commissioned to design a monument to the Ames family, the creators of the Transcontinental Railroad. The site was the highest elevation of that railroad near Billings, Montana. Richardson crafted an idiosyncratic pyramid, which towards the ground huddles low, like a squatting wrestler trying to find his center of gravity, gathering his contained force before he leaps upward at a sharper angle. Here is a depiction of the mental energy needed to create the railroad, abstractly rendered. First, the gathering of mental force, and then the release of that force. Imagine if this were designed today by Frank Gehry or George Siegel. I suppose it would be a disheartening statue of a man looking at a map with a model choo-choo in his hand. The Ames Memorial suggests infinity. The King Memorial suggests wordplay. In other words, it is book illustration. It is the visual diagram of ideas generated elsewhere. It is a good index of where we stand today. We are in a position now where we are afraid to leave something out. This accounts for our addiction to literalism, but monumentality requires fearless conviction. And it can be done, and it doesn't necessarily require neoclassicism. What can we do? First, we can recognize that it is possible to make a convincing monument with the means of modern architecture. Saarinen showed that it is possible with his gateway arch at St. Louis, an exquisite portal to the west, our version of a Roman triumphal arch. Abstract, but its visual logic is direct and persuasive. A timeless opening into the continent. The second lesson is, it is not too late. Just because a world-famous architect has submitted a design does not oblige us to build it. The history of this city is crammed full of earnest and quite sincere designs that were nevertheless politely shoved into a back cupboard, like this one for the Washington Monument. And the third lesson is that greatness is possible. For more than a century and a half, we built great monuments with spectacular success. We have only been building them badly for a generation. I look at these designs, which are perhaps an honest reflection of our divided and uncertain culture, and I can't help think we can do better. We have done better in the past, and we can do so again. Thank you. There's a question right here. Right here.
Professor, thank you for your facts and your opinions. I raise two possible questions. One, you make no mention of the many equestrian statues around town. Your opinion would be requested. And the other is, I don't know if you're aware that in one of the states, I believe Utah, those roadside monuments to the death of 6 state troopers was recently ruled unconstitutional by a local judge because it somehow combined government and religion.
Really? That's outrageous. I did not know. Those roadside shrines are very important. They say many things. I can't begin to go into their meaning today. That's interesting. This city has many great equestrian statues. I left them out because I felt that my talk, like a monument, had to leave things out. I think the finest of all, my opinion, is the great statue to Grant by Gratefully behind the Capitol. It is superb. There are many great ones throughout the city. And one of the joys of Washington, L'Enfant's brilliant plan to Washington, he did not want a federal city with a single point of power. He wanted a decentralized city. And all the rondelles offer multiple points for statuary. And it's a pleasure to go anywhere in this low-slung, far-reaching city and to come upon an equestrian statue. I love them. Yeah.
Very good talk. Milton Grenfell with the National Civic Art Society. There's, I think, a deeper problem to doing monuments today, and I think it's certain relativism, that if you don't agree on what is noble and good, you can't really make a memorial or a monument to that. And I would say that was the argument, and that's my actual complaint about the Vietnam Memorial, is that the men who fought there felt, for the most part, they were about a noble business, and to war and to put your life on the line for other people is always noble, and it is always good, and good is always beautiful. And I think the scar in the earth in black was not beautiful. For whatever it is, it only commemorates the loss, but there was more to talk about there than loss. So, but I think at that time, people didn't want to say there was anything beautiful about Vietnam. But whenever a man sacrifices life for another man, there's beauty there because there's nobility and goodness, and that's always beautiful.
That's a very good point. I agree. It is a void, and every monument, every good monument, has one gesture, and there the gesture is a loss, not a presence. You could take away that lesson. I would have preferred something more idealistic and positive. However, I think it is artistically successful. And the judgment for that is it's public art, and the public embraced it the first day. And the veterans who opposed it, as you know, pretty much have come to love it. I would say the lesson is nothing has divided us as much as Vietnam did. Nothing. It is possible, even in our divided culture, to make a great unifying monument. Maybe, perhaps, that was not the one, but it is still possible. So I disagree that the necessary consequence of division is a divided object. But I take your point.
My name is Michael Zack. I wrote a history of the Republican Party. Thank you for noting that the roadside crosses began in the 1980s.
Am I right about that?
Yes, you are, and I'll add to it, that practice was brought to the U.S. by Latin American immigrants. Hundreds of years of roadside shrines to loss in Latin America. So that was a cultural contribution from Latin America, and it's wonderful, I think.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting, because at this point, that's forgotten. They are now part of the common American cultural coin. Interesting.
My name is Eric Bootsma, and I'm also with the National Civic Arts Society, and I want to thank you for putting up some of the images that from the Eisenhower Memorial controversy, because that is something that our organization has been working on, revealing the truth about the Eisenhower Memorial. But one of the things I found very interesting is that you did bring out the distinction between particularity and universality, that we have a problem right now dealing with universality, that we have a problem with greatness. Aristotle, of course, mentions this in the Poetics, that poetry is more philosophical and tells more truth than history, because it tells the way things ought to be rather than what they actually are. And I think it's very interesting that today Gary chooses to use photographs to show Eisenhower rather than an image, because he's incapable of showing Eisenhower as he ought to be, but that he can only show as he was. And so too with a lot of the memorials, and I won't quibble any further with the Vietnam Memorial, but it seems to be that a lot of them get caught up in particularity, and so that they're very interested in telling the truth as it actually was, rather than telling, as Mr. Grenfell pointed out, the way things ought to be, and the higher notions of greatness and of sacrifice. And I might point then further to Tocqueville, who said that there exists in the heart of man a lawful and a good sense of equality that seeks to raise every man up to the level of greatness. But there's also a perverse sense of equality, which rather than lifting men great, seeks to bring them all down to their level, that men would prefer equality and slavery than greatness to exist. So I'd just like to hear a comment whether or not you think it's possible for us to find that greatness again, or are we caught in particularity in the age that we live in with Twitter and the 24-hour news cycle, that we're always caught in what is actually true than what is poetically true?
Well, that's a very big question. Culture is a living thing, and I don't know the future. There is no question, I see it in my students, that Twitter has changed the mental furniture of the minds of my students, how they process information. I don't know where that will go. I like your focus on particularity. If I had to summarize, I would say particularity is what prevents these things from being true monuments. I would offer this thought to you. I wonder how much this insistence on specifics, literal display of specifics, is connected to what happened to language in the 1970s. Because there was a certain moment, it was about 1977, I was in college, I remember it, you could no longer make a statement like, man does not live in bread alone, because people would say, well, what about women? So, well, men and women cannot live on. And the moment people began to pay attention to the gender equality and other forms of equality in their words, they lost the habit of the poetic generalization, which is essential for allegory. I think it relates to a nervousness about ruling out, and that pledges you to a very painful, strictly literal, non-figurative language, and now our monuments are suffering from it as much as our prose.
Could the contrast between what we see today and what we have seen in the past essentially be something like too many cooks spoil the soup?
Committees, you mean?
Exactly,
Committees.
exactly. Yeah.
I see one of the committee members behind you nodding vigorously. Yeah, this city and New York are the hardest cities in the world to get anything done artistically because of the filters. Worse here. I think that is a big part of it, and the situation's got worse and worse. John Russell Pope was able to design the Jefferson Memorial almost carte blanche, and that world has vanished. I think you're right. Yeah, bureaucratic dilution. Yeah. Do we have time for one more? I know we've got a time limit, or a couple more.
Are we on here? Okay.
What do I think of the Air Force Memorial? I'm asked. Yes, not bad, not good.
Excuse
It
me.
yearns upwards. It has some idealism. I like that quality. Back there, ma'am?
Have you any knowledge of the Adams Memorial?
Oh, here. America's finest memorial. Augustus St. Gaudens, the Adam Memorial here in Rock Creek Park. That's the best. No, not that Adams Memorial.
No.
Oh.
They're going to,
To President Adams.
yes, to John Adams, Abigail,
Oh,
and
no.
John Quincy.
I do not know.
You know nothing about that?
No, but I doubt it will be America's greatest monument. Somehow.
Well, I'm an Adams descendant, and from what I hear, you're absolutely right.
This will be our final question.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Nicholson. I had the privilege of being the CEO and the Secretary of the American Battle Monuments Commission, responsible for overseas American monuments and cemeteries dedicated to those Americans who lost their lives ejecting invaders from our allies' countries and restoring their freedom. And there are 23 of those cemeteries around the world. To put it in the words of a former chief of state of a European country who said, and who does still say in many of his speeches, when I was 8 years old, my father took me to the Anzio Cemetery and said to me, look at those graves. Most of them are for boys between the ages of 18 and 25 who left their homes to come here and restore freedom in our country. Don't forget it. Well, this chief of state goes to one of those cemeteries every year, and he takes his kids and his grandchildren. Millions of Europeans, not just from the countries who were freed up by Americans, by those hundreds of thousands of Americans who died doing that, but from Eastern European countries and Asian countries go to those memorials. And I respectfully suggest to you, sir, please try to mention that, because outside the United States, that is a big factor in people's opinion about our country. Thank you, sir.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. I thank you for the reminder. And thank you for your attention today and putting up with my failing voice. Thank you.